Good evening. Welcome to this webinar, Battling the Heat, about the experiences friends in Portland experienced last June. My name is Madeleine Helmer. I work with the Dutch Climate Alliance and I'm project leader on heat adaptation. And I'm very happy that we could create this opportunity tonight to have two guests from Portland that some of you who attended a meeting in Utrecht 2 months ago may recognize, because we started that meeting on heat with a presentation about the experience in Portland. And we felt, because of the time difference, we have a difference of 9 hours, there could not be any interaction. So these were pre-recorded interviews that we presented there. But many of them were many of them who attended the meeting were very impressed by your stories. So we said, let's try to have a live connection. And we are very pleased, Jonna and Vivek, that we could set it up tonight. We have sent out the message to people who might be interested to join, and we're quite a large group of people with very different backgrounds, coming from health, coming from housing, coming from habitat. And that's exactly the frame in which we work on heat in the Netherlands, to look at those 3 angles of risks for, in particularly, people most vulnerable to heat risks. We will set up the seminar for 2 hours. The first hour we will listen with all our ears open to your presentation, Jonna and Vivek from Portland. And we, of course, there will opportunities for interactions. We have 3 co-referents who will then ask you from their backgrounds. And let me please introduce all of you for this first webinar session. And then after that, we will have 2 breakout groups, and I will come back to that later. First of all, let me introduce our guests. Jonna and I've been exercising on your name, and you even had it out loud in your handwriting. Jonna Papiefetimiou, more or less, from Portland, Chief Resilience Officer, also connected to the C40 Global Network on Resilience. Maybe you can shortly introduce yourself.
Certainly. Yeah, my name is Jonna Papiefetimiou, and I work for the City of Portland in the Bureau of Emergency Management. My title there is Chief Resilience Officer. And during the heat dome last year, we were between directors at the Bureau of Emergency Management. So I was also the interim director of the Bureau of Emergency Management and reporting to the mayor during the events that we're going to talk about.
Thank you. Our second guest is Vivek Chandas from the Portland University, working on climate adaptation. Vivek, may I give you the floor for a short introduction?
Sure. Thank you, Madeleine, and thank you everybody for coming. It's a real honor, privilege to be here with you. I am a professor of climate adaptation at Portland State University. I've been working on issues related to heat for about 15 years and primarily focusing on spatial dimensions of it, though also a lot of community-based resilience questions that we're pursuing. Also serve as an advisor and a consultant, environmental consultant on applied projects around the country.
Thank you. We look very much forward to your presentation. Then I'd like to present the 3 co-hosts and co-referents who will be first in line to reflect on your presentations. Helene Mees of University of Utrecht. Can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, hello everyone, I'm Helene Mees. I'm an assistant professor at Utrecht University here in the Netherlands. And well, I do a lot of research on climate adaptation at the local urban level, and I focus mostly on governance questions. And in particular, I look at responsibilities and how they are divided between public and private actors. And I also look at the roles of citizens in addressing climate adaptation issues, amongst which, of course, heat adaptation.
Thank you. Lisette, from Vienna, from a European conference there. Wi-Fi saves the world.
Yes, I'm Lisette Klok, and that I'm in Vienna now, but I work in Amsterdam for the University of Applied Sciences. I'm a climate researcher. But I'm a lecturer as well on climate adaptation, and I've done a lot of research on how we can adapt our cities to more heat and how we can design our cities heat resilient. I work together with Jeroen.
That's an introduction, Jeroen.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Jeroen Kluk. I'm professor at Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. And I work together with Lisette. I have a whole research group mainly focusing on urban climate adaptation. And urban heat is one of the main topics. So we have been looking at design guidelines for the urban for the urban area. But now we're also looking at buildings. So we're doing the whole thing. All about interventions, not like Helene about governance.
It's applied. Okay, thank you for the introduction and very welcome all the other attendants. I will not ask you to introduce yourself, but in the breakout groups, for those who will join those, there is more time for that and we can have more time for interaction among yourselves. Could I please ask Jonna to give a presentation? We started up from this end by my colleague Randy, and here we go.
Ah, wonderful. Thank you. I trust you can all see it and hear me. Thanks. Let's see, I'll just jump right in so we can have I'm most interested in hearing your questions and having time for some interaction at the end. So I'll say I work at the Bureau of Emergency Management, and I've been there for about 10 years now. We respond to a variety of weather and floods, all different kinds of emergencies. But I particularly am going to talk to you about one incident which occurred last June in 2021 when I was the interim director there and managing the city's response. And I'd just like to give you an overview of the presentation. I'll just start by kind of giving you, describe the events that occurred that June to maybe help you tell the story in your own mind of how a heat wave rolls out in a city that's unfamiliar with heat. And so share some information about what we did and the actions that we took, both the things we had practiced before and a lot of new things that we had not tried before that we did because of the how serious the emergency was, and then acknowledge some things that did not work and some really devastating losses that we had from that heat wave. And then after that, kind of describe how we're approaching it differently this summer, because we are just now in May coming around to the 1-year anniversary and thinking about how we'll approach heat differently this year. So that's kind of an overview. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the incident timeline, how did it start? It was on Tuesday, the 22nd of June, that we first flagged a prediction from our National Weather Service that the heat would be dangerously high beginning in the coming weekend. So that's the amount of time. So we started on Tuesday and we thought until Saturday to get prepared. Next slide, please. Then on Wednesday and Thursday and Friday, as the weather warmed incrementally, we rushed to prepare ourselves for the heat dome. We weren't calling it a heat dome then, for the heat wave. We identified locations where we could open up cooling shelters, so community center, convention center, where people could go to get cool. We delivered supplies to those locations that we in the past had used just for severe cold weather. When we shelter houseless people overnight, cots, food, blankets. We don't have a permanent staff of shelter workers because it's something we do only very occasionally. And so we recruited volunteers. We asked our city and county workers to volunteer, and we asked community members to volunteer to work in the shelters. In Portland, we also have a quite large population of people who are houseless, who live on the streets or in cars. And we assessed that they were people who had faced the greatest risk from heat because they had no one to get inside. And so we use the same workers who do street outreach for other kinds of services, medical services, food distribution, to encourage houseless people to get prepared for the heat and make a plan to get inside. And finally, we really increased our messaging through the social media and in the news. And the message that we came back to often was that it is life-threatening heat, that is extremely hot. It's life-threatening heat. So encouraging people to make a plan to stay cool. Next slide, please. Then on Saturday, the heat hit as predicted. Friday was warm, but not, it was unseasonably warm for June, but it was not a record-setting day at all. It was just, you know, pretty warm. But on Saturday, it started getting hot early, and we opened the shelters, and it was good that we did, because on Saturday, the first day of the heat dome, we set a new temperature record for the hottest temperature ever recorded in the city of Portland. It reached 108 degrees Fahrenheit. It was about 42 Celsius. It was extremely hot. Then the worst, from our perspective, we knew it was going to be hot on Saturday. That was exceeded temperature expectations, but only by a couple of degrees. But the problem was Saturday night, it didn't cool off. It stayed warm overnight. So people who maybe thought they could just get through the heat of the day and find some relief in the evening did not find that relief. And then on Sunday, when the sun came up, it quickly warmed up again, and it reached 112 degrees Fahrenheit that day. So about like 44.5 Celsius. So that heat record that we set on Saturday stood for less than 24 hours before it was again exceeded by a new all-time high temperature, recorded temperature in the city, to reach 112. And then it was on Sunday that our shelters started to become very full. People who had made it through one day felt like they couldn't make it through another day with the heat, and it started. And Sunday night it did not cool off. And then on Monday it reached 115 degrees Fahrenheit, which is extraordinarily hot. The hottest day that ever recorded in Portland, 46 degrees Celsius, is really, it's unheard of. And the shelters were just totally overwhelmed. I worked overnight in a shelter that night, and there was almost 600 people sleeping in cots in our convention center. Just a spectrum of Portlanders, houseless people, mothers with small children, elderly people, everybody crammed in. We didn't turn anyone away, but it was extremely crowded. We also saw our emergency calls to our first responders, like police, fire, ambulance, rise on Saturday, and that also increased every day. And we also saw, just to give a sense of the heat, that the air conditioning failed in a lot of public buildings. Some of our own community centers and office buildings lost air conditioning, and in a major street, the pavement buckled because of the heat, and the road had to be closed. So all that occurred, and then it cooled off again, and the heat, it was warm, but it was, the temperature just, it dissipated. No, that's fine. Thank you. It is the next slide. So this is just a diagram. This was actually in the New York Times newspaper right after the heat wave, but I think it's a great graphic to show kind of where those three red dots are 3 hot days, and the other scatter diagram is the maximum daily temperature for every other day since 1979. So you can see it was just there were far outliers in terms of temperature. Next slide, please. This is showing the calls to our 911 system, so our like fire, police, ambulance, emergency response system. You can see how it's warmed up on Friday, and then steadily Saturday, Sunday, and on Monday, we had a call volume that was 10 times an ordinary call volume. And so you can also imagine that our ambulance response, our police and fire response to incidents was really delayed. People were waiting hours, or just nobody was coming because we did not have enough responders to reach all the calls that were there. So this was tremendously stressful, and also that the workers who were taking those calls were also suffering from the heat and a sense of trauma, but by not being able to help people in the way that they wanted to. Next slide, please. So in response to this steadily escalating heat and this sense of emergency, in addition to opening the cooling shelters and telling people to stay cool, doing outreach to houseless people, which are actions that we've taken in the past, we also tried a lot of new things during the heat wave, and a lot of it was also driven by a community desire to help that was encouraging and sort of something good that came out of it. We had non-governmental organizations, churches, and community centers that spontaneously opened their doors to let people come inside and get cool. And we encouraged them to do that. And we, in fact, afterwards agreed to pay them back for cleaning supplies and masks and water, food that they bought in order to welcome the community in. We made a partnership with them kind of spontaneously to help them do that. We also had some portable air conditioning units that belonged to the city, and we loaned them out to those not-for-profits. So like a large senior apartment building, we loaned them an air conditioning unit. They put it in their lobby so people could come down to the lobby and cool off. Also, this turned out, I'll talk some more about this, but turned out to be a great idea. A not-governmental organization, just a group of neighbors really, set up a tent with like misters, like water sprayers at the top, and they set it up in a park so people could just come, that came to the park could come and sit under the misters and cool off. We also used our volunteers to call people in apartment buildings that were senior apartment buildings or apartment buildings that house primarily people with disabilities, to see if they were, to just check in and say like, are you okay? Do you need help? And if nobody answered the phone after repeated calls, or if the person seemed confused when they spoke to them or they did need help, then they called the building manager and asked them to go check on the person in that apartment and help them get out of the apartment to get safe. We also went in person and visited some low-income senior housing buildings where we couldn't get phone lists, or where people were very low income and didn't have phones, and we knocked on doors and we left flyers to tell people about the cooling shelters. And then finally, recognizing, particularly in the US context, because of social inequity and really a long history of very terrible racism, there are communities, particularly Black and brown communities, that really don't trust government, and also many immigrant communities that don't trust government because of their experiences either here or in the place where they came from. And so recognizing that we weren't always the right messenger, we also prepared messages about heat safety and the availability of shelters, and we shared them out with not governmental organizations, so churches and cultural institutions that had earned trust in other communities where government was not welcome, and we asked them to share those messages in their own communities by email and social media, and we had those translated into 12 different languages so that we could hope to reach the broadest a number of residents. So those are all ways that we tried to serve our residents during this heat dome. Next slide, please. And it wasn't enough. And that was, of course, the heartbreaking part, is that we saw many deaths, 49 deaths just in the city of Portland. And they were spread across the city. But in particular, we saw deaths in places where we know there are heat islands, where there's a lot of pavement, there's not a lot of tree canopy, and where the temperature gets really hot. Those are places where disproportionately we saw also deaths in the community. And this is something that took us time to realize, because most of the people who died alone in their apartments, and it wasn't recognized until after the heat dome ended that they had passed away. And so this was information that trickled out in the weeks following the heat dome, and it was heartbreaking for everyone who worked on the response, and it caused great public anger and consternation, as it should, that so many people died during this heat wave. Next slide, please. And so we had to do some real reflection and soul searching about what were our failures, what went wrong, how could this happen to us in our city? And I think the biggest thing that came back to us was that the communication was our greatest failure, that it was almost just a failure of imagination, that in a city like Portland that had had 2 heat deaths in the last century, that we could have 50 heat deaths in the space of a few days was just beyond our thinking. And even as responders, we didn't recognize this, and we did not convey it to the public that they would take action to protect themselves. There were space in the shelters that was open. There were rides available, but residents didn't think that they needed help, and so they didn't access available resources. And disproportionately, we see the people that passed away were older white men who lived alone. I think race is maybe Portland is a more diverse city now than it was 50 years ago. And so we look at our elder population, it is disproportionately white. So I think that's part of it, is just the demographics of people who are older. But there's also, at least in my own mind, it's people who died alone they had social isolation. They didn't have someone to ask for help, or they were ashamed to ask for help. And so they just thought they would take care of themselves at home and try and be okay. They didn't have a family or community that they would check in with. And as a result, they passed away. And also, obviously, income was a tremendous factor, because people who had air conditioning were able to get through the heat dome fine. We didn't have any power interruptions or anything like that, but nobody who passed away had a working air conditioning unit. So, those were just profound failures. And then some other things that we noted that we also worked to address is if more people had sought help, the transportation resources were limited. It's very hard to wait for the bus if you're already overheated, and now you have to go outside and wait in the heat for a bus to come. And so we recognized that that was potentially a limiting factor. And really probably underlying all that was just the reason we hadn't addressed that is we did not have plans that anticipated this type of event. This was just outside our imagination. Next, we really acknowledge those as failures. Thank you. And so the first thing we did, kind of in response to that, was a novel action for us, and that we will take again if it gets hot again this summer, and that we did even later last summer in August when we had another heat wave, is we use a system called wireless emergency alerts. I imagine there's something similar exists in Europe, but it's a 90-character text message that goes out to all mobile phones. It's like a federal government emergency messaging system. It's usually used to warn people about like tornadoes or other fast-moving, or tsunamis, like other fast-moving events. But it's a good way to reach everyone because it hits every single mobile phone that's near a cellular tower. You don't have to opt into the system or share your number. Any working phone will get this message. And so you can see the message that we used later in the summer and that we would continue to use. It'll make it, we're sparing in it because it's also alarming when we not activate this system, but it makes, if you're in a room of people, every single person's phone starts to make a warning tone at once, and everyone gets the same message. And this is it. And there's a link at the end, you can see a hot link, and if you click on that link, it gives the same message in all our 12 languages that we had translated to. So this was like the first intervention that we did to say we really failed in communication. People didn't see this as an emergency. We must try and reach all residents immediately if we feel heat is life-threatening. And so this was a step that we took. Oh, and the last time we did it was Friday the 13th, last year. Next slide, please. In addition to that, we have planned a lot of other actions coming for the summer that is now just before us. One is to continue to use that wireless emergency alert, that WIA, for severe heat. To continue to have no turn away cooling centers, to open them at community centers and really have a practice that no one gets turned away. If there's not room, if we're full, then we'll invite people inside while we call a taxi or arrange transportation to another safe location. Even if people are drunk, have mental health issues, or in other ways are difficult to accommodate in the shelter environment, we'll find a way to keep them inside until we can get them to another safe place, because we don't want to put anybody out in the heat that's unsafe. We're also going to do a whole bunch more of those pop-up park misting stations. Those were very well received in the community for a lot of reasons. They're friendly for people who don't want to be in a shelter environment, which could be for a lot of reasons, because you don't like crowds, because you've had trauma in a shelter environment before, because you have a dog or pets that you don't want to leave, because you are houseless and you have a lot of stuff that you want to keep with you all the time. For a variety of reasons, people don't always want to go to a shelter, but these open air misting stations and parks feel like no barrier to come and use them. And so we've purchased a whole bunch more of them, and we've used the heat maps to identify parks and heat islands and hot parts of the city where we're going to pop them up. We also have gotten even more systematic about our outreach to people that live outside on the street, or to people who live in low income apartments or apartments where they don't have AC, to try and use more volunteers in a more systematic way to reach more people. We also have worked with our transit agency, TriMet, to say that on a day when the heat emergency is declared, transit will be free, so that no one would be turned away from a subway train or a bus because they don't have the correct fare, that the drivers don't do fare enforcement. And really, the bus company was not doing this during the heat dome, and they were very criticized for it. And the way that we have come to talk about it is to say, in that kind of event, people are standing outside, they're drowning in a sea of heat. And the bus that comes is the lifeboat that picks them up and rescues them from that that sea. And just as a lifeboat cannot ask you to collect a fare and tell you cannot get on board if you do not have the right change, that the bus cannot turn people away when the heat is so high. And so that was really kind of shamed, I would say, our transit agency into doing that, but they are committed to that now. And then finally, knowing that for some people, just waiting outside for the buses would still be overwhelming, that we have worked to set up volunteer drivers and volunteer call takers. So if people call and ask for a ride to a cooling shelter, that we won't get overwhelmed, that we feel confident we have enough volunteers that we can transport people. Next slide, please. We also, see, I'm coming up on time, I'll be quick, but really a lot of our work has, our response actions have come out of mutual aid efforts of community members helping one another. And so we've also really systematized a lot of those approaches where we're giving away air conditioning units to many more community groups. We're hosting trainings on how to host a cooling space. So like teaching people like how to make sure it's accessible for wheelchairs, how to, give people something to do or something to watch to engage them. So kind of giving a training about that. We're making a system of those small grants to not-for-profits or NGOs to do outreach. We're working with more community-based organizations to be our volunteers and help us do the phone checks. And we've really expanded our list of non-governmental organizations that we work with to more than 100 of them, and to make sure that we pre-translated all our messaging so that we can reach those communities well. Next slide, please. That's our misting stations. And we just had fun with this because we're so monolingual often in the United States, but we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to tell everyone what a misting tent was. So I just wanted to share that. And then next slide, this will be my last slide. I think this is more where Viva can talk, but we also recognize that all the interventions I've talked about are emergency responses and not really getting at the long range problem of heat. And so we also are planting trees. Vivek and I are working on a pilot to put heat sensors inside buildings. We're giving away free air conditioning units this summer for low-income residents. And also the state of Oregon has passed some legislation that says a right to cooling that allows, that says everyone has a right to install an air conditioning unit if they can buy one, and that in the future that landlords will have to keep apartments cooler. That's my last slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonna. Well, this was a storm of information, and you really draw us into your experience last year. I would like to invite participants to use the chat if you have additional questions to Jonna. But there are a few lines from your presentation that really caught me. You said this was beyond imagination, and that made it hard to plan for. And that the communication was difficult. And I remember because we made some video, we looked at some videos, and that's quite familiar here. When you're in a cool place and that cool place is a TV station, you become a little bit, how hot it is. So the giggling part of communicating about the heat was something that struck me, the contrary between the images from the TV studio and the presenters, and then the videos from the cooling shelters themselves. So we do recognize that that's one of the key problems on communicating the life-threatening part of heat. Well, at the other end, many people enjoy it as well. Maybe not extreme heat, but at least when you're close to it. But before, I would like to ask our three co-hosts whether they would have a reflection or a question on Jonna's presentation. Who can I give the floor?
Well,
Helene.
Yes, can I start?
Sure.
Thanks so much, Jonna, for this really interesting presentation, and it's really nice to see how a practitioner like you is dealing with this. You call it heat dome, I think. This is a nice expression I didn't know, but this, of course, even though I think you managed quite well, still so many people died. So that's, of course, very unfortunate. With respect to those deaths, you mentioned that the people that were at risk were those people that were older, white, and were also in isolation from friends and neighbors, families, and so on, and they had no air conditioning. And I also noticed in your slides that for future you would like to have even more outreach to those at-risk people. Could you elaborate a bit more on how you would like to do that? And also particularly how you would like to get behind their doors, because knocking on their doors is one thing, but getting really into their their system basically, and changing their behaviors is another.
Totally. I appreciate this question. I'll just say, in terms of how we reach more people, I think that as government, a part of what we have to do is have some humility to realize we can't be the rescuer and communicate with everyone. If that's our goal, we'll never succeed. But what we needed to do and what we're moving towards is to change our messaging to encourage everyone who receives the message to check on one other person, so instead of us saying that we're going to tell everyone to stay safe and check on everybody and make sure they listen to us, to say, check on your neighbor, check on your mom, check on someone from church, check on someone, that retired last year, your coworker. And so ask everyone to take responsibility to check on someone, because we can't reach everyone, but everybody has at least one person, right? I hope in their life that's that person. And so I think that that's a part of it. And I also think, sadly, that the events of this last summer will be remembered for a long time, but that will give people the motivation to be persistent in there. So if they knock on the door and nobody answers, not to say, I guess they're not home, but to say, let's bang a little harder and see if they come out. I'm hopeful also that for people who survive the heat dome but who are at risk, that it will encourage them to be responsive to those requests. And we've also because a number of us have this sense, like, part of it is that people don't want to admit they need help. I don't know if that's an American thing, but like, I just have this like old white guy at home that's like, I'm fine, I don't need anybody. And so also to try and have this message that says like reassure your children you're okay. Like, don't make your children worry about you. To help them see the checking in as like a service, a gift that they're giving to their kids, because maybe they'll be more willing to do that than to admit that they need help, even if they do. Sorry, that was a long answer, but that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you. Thank you. Very helpful. Lisette or Jeroen, you have a question? Or
yes, I can have a question. Jonas, thank you very much for your presentation. So incredible how hot it got. My first small question is, how it didn't cool off this Saturday night, but how cold did it get this night?
Oh, at the nights. Oh, good question. It cooled down. It was like 74 and 76 Fahrenheit. Someone's gonna have to help me translate that into Celsius. But
to find it out, somebody might do it in the meantime. Okay. So, and then the other question. There's no, and first I'd like to translate for the Dutch people. Okay, I think Portland has 500,000 inhabitants, so like 50 people dying would be like 1,500 or 600 in the Netherlands. So in a few days, it's really a lot. It's incredible. But did you also investigate? I saw this question from Lauren van Miltenburg in the chat. Did you check where the people died? Were there specific areas where it seemed hotter, or was it just the areas where the people were poorer, or the type of people?
Oh, good question. If you saw the slide, it was a heat map in the back and the numbers around it, and the numbers were by zip code. It's a postal code. And so that's how we, for the privacy of individuals, we didn't map their houses, but we mapped them by their postal district that they're in. And so we do see that there were deaths in every postal code, but there were more in places that were low income, which are also places that are heat islands, because there's a lot there about less investment in trees and parks, and like the green spaces in cities that are the good neighborhoods have more of that.
Mm-hmm. But the question was, were these also the poorer areas? Not only the hotter, but also the poorer.
Yes, yeah, and as particularly downtown, which is a lot of rich people, but also a lot of poor people. And then in the eastern part of our city, that is more low income.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Sure. Well, when you ask put questions on the chat. There comes the wave. And then I must say, we don't have enough time to
I'll put some responses in the chat as well.
That would be lovely. That would be lovely, because you partly know Vivek's story. So thank you for that assistance. Vivek, may I invite you, because you are from the long-term planning, which what we know is climate adaptation, of course, in the Netherlands as well. So how can you build the resilience to reduce the risks, even though it will get hotter, that the impact will be less? And we look very much forward to your presentation, basically what you've learned, but what you already knew or has been confirmed by the heat wave you experienced in Portland. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you again. It's I think my third time following Jana on a presentation, and I have to say I'm often just really challenged because she's so smart, incredibly engaged, and so articulate with this work. I'm going to try to follow up with maybe presenting a little bit of a wider time frame is what I'm going to really offer you today, because I've been working on this for quite some time, and I'd really like to hone in on specific time points, kind of like a lawyer does when they're doing a litigative activity. They look at specific time points at which things happen. And so in a way, what Jana presented is a reflection of a response. And what I'd like to do is kind of take that back a little bit and give you context as to why this happened, and in a way what it meant for us as we were trying to bring a lot of the pieces together. And really, I have to commend you all for doing this, because it's really a kind of a global climate issue, and having opportunities to learn from each other is, again, a way of showing leadership in this field. And I really commend you on being able to bring us into the conversation, having so recently experienced this. And it's a tremendously progressive activity that you're engaged with through this collaboration that you've started. And so I will go ahead and just get started. I'm calling this shade equity in part because it's really the conversation we're having across the region as well as many parts of the country. This idea of why are some places a lot cooler and why are some places a lot warmer, even within one metropolitan region. And this particular event, meteorologically called a heat dome, was really helpful for us to characterize how well prepared or mal-prepared Portland is. I'll just tell you from my own perspective, I moved to Portland in 1995 and then left for a number of years and came back again in 2005. And I came back here when Portland was right in the center of the sustainability revolution. In fact, many people when I arrived were calling Portland the new Amsterdam. And we're really trying to describe it as a place where lots of biking, greenery, high density, urban growth boundaries, and just a lovely, lovely landscape that indigenous communities have been caring for and stewarding for time immemorial. And so upon white settlers in the region, we really started to recognize that there are certain ways of characterizing sustainability. And as I came into the city, I was completely committed to this agenda of sustainability. And so I started into this conversation through a university setting and starting a research lab, trying to understand where science can really support the policy process. And so I came in with this conceptual model of trying to understand what patterns of development, how those patterns were driven by specific policies or economic systems, what the impacts were, and then what processes were changed or created as a result of those particular patterns. So this was kind of my conceptual model coming into this work. And I was really interested in finding ways to situate the lab, the Sustaining Urban Places Research Lab at the university, in the setting where we could be collaborating with policymakers like Jana and others to understand what the problems that they were facing, how to kind of do assessments and respond to the needs of the time. We've worked on issues around flooding, pluvial flooding, worked on issues of water demand management, worked on urban canopy and trees and green space. So really very broad collaborative environmental research. And so this was kind of the context upon which this work in heat really started. I just wanted to spend 1 minute on that. Early work, this is going back to 2009, We engaged in conversations with engineers, with geographers, with sociologists to really try to bring an interdisciplinary lens to this idea of heat. And we were, when I started this work, I'd been to several meetings in a room, and I will just say that I was essentially laughed out of the room at the time because people would say to me, Portland is a very mild climate. We've had thousands of years of mild climate. We are not going to get an extreme event like a heat wave. So there's really much more, as we say in the US, there are bigger fish to fry. And this is one of those questions of my wanting to do the scientific research that's relevant, yet not getting the receptivity of communities to really respond to this. And so we published our papers, continued our work with instrumentation, and then really landed on a technique of understanding urban heat that's not just scientifically focused, but involves the community in that process. And so we started this whole community-based participatory climate science program as a way to install sensors on cars and bicycles and go out and map the temperature in different parts of the city. This was something that's been done in a very technical kind of engineering or meteorological sense. We wanted to bring this to community members in part because we knew that people have been measuring their body temperature since they were children. It's a very intuitive idea to talk about temperature, and why not bring this out to a community group to have them then describe how these differences in heat can help develop adaptation strategies neighborhood by neighborhood. And what we found through this work, which has now expanded over 50 cities across the US, and this year actually we're doing this campaign in Freetown, Sierra Leone, in Bandung, Indonesia, and in Rio, Brazil. It's really taken off on an international level. In Portland, we found that these patterns, these were generated in 2014, these patterns of temperature in the morning, this is air temperature in the morning, air temperature in the afternoon, and air temperature in the evening really varies. And the times when people die most frequently from heat waves is during the night when they're sleeping. And so one of the things we really wanted to do is understand how those evening temperatures translated to the socio-demographics, meaning the people who lived in the hottest parts of Portland. Again, time-based 2014. Right? And we published this a few years later, but this was really the finding that we had, is that the hottest parts of Portland included those communities that had the least formal education, had the least English proficiency, these were a lot of immigrant communities, had the highest racial diversity, and had extreme poverty in those neighborhoods. And that the white communities had more access to central air conditioning, and that Asian and elderly communities had less access to heat refuges, meaning places where communities could go during the heat wave. So this was going back now 7 years, right? And we published this in a book as well. Just one of my two shameless plugs in this presentation for this work where we were trying to understand the relationship between urban form and kind of heat in a city. And this was, again, several years ago. We took this work and kind of asked the question of, what does it mean to do this in multiple cities? So this came out in the New York Times several years later in 2019, highlighting Portland, highlighting Washington, D.C., highlighting Albuquerque, and highlighting the idea that there are big differences, upwards of sometimes 12 degrees Celsius differences between one part of the city and another part of the city. And that was really eye-opening for the decision makers as well as communities and folks in Washington, D.C. and warm, humid places where we had done this campaign, like Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Richmond. They really started going into preparedness planning based on some of these mapping efforts. And so National Geographic had a small piece on this in Washington, D.C., showing the differences between one area and another. And that really got us a lot of media attention on this work, though it was largely outside of the Portland metro region. And so we started asking the question as we started doing this all around the country, and what Jana had alluded to is that the US, that these heat differences don't just happen by happenstance. In fact, they're very consistent with planning policies that have segregated some communities into what we call redlined areas, meaning areas where low income, African American often, communities of color, as is termed in the US, as well as immigrant communities live. In the 1930s, these red lines were drawn in urban neighborhoods around the US, and these were places that were very different than the green lined areas. And so the green line and the red line were two opposite areas, where green lines were largely wealthy, white, racially identified people, and the red lines were often people of color and lower income communities that lived there. And so when we looked at these patterns of heat and we looked at these kind of maps, I was kind of amazed that I was noticing a consistency. And so we did a study of 108 cities across the US and found that these red-lined areas were on average across the 108 cities we looked at about 2.5 degrees Celsius warmer than their green-lined counterparts. And this was a pattern that held up in 95% of our cities across the region. And when we looked a little more closely, we found that those heat patterns really reflected what was on the landscape in these neighborhoods. In fact, we found that the A neighborhoods, remember these are the quote wealthy white neighborhoods across the 108 cities, often had more tree canopy and less impervious surface, whereas the D neighborhoods had orders of magnitude greater amount of impervious surface, meaning concrete, asphalt, than tree canopy. And if you know anything about US history, then you'll appreciate the fact that through the 1950s, when major roadways were being laid, when lots of development was occurring, that those large land-hungry developments went to areas that were lower land values, which were disinvested over decades. And as a result, the highways, the large-scale housing projects, the industrial facilities all went to these specific parts of cities, and these were places that really had so much asphalt and concrete, they absorbed the sun's solar radiation and makes them much hotter, which is what we were able to measure in many of our physical science campaigns. And so this was something that was an aha moment for us as we started noticing that Portland, and this was again 2020 now, coming 1 year later, Portland was at the top of the list of the difference between the red-lined areas and the green-lined areas. The Fahrenheit difference was almost 13 degrees on average between one part of Portland and another part of Portland. And this difference, it may seem trivial to a certain extent, though this is an average, and we were actually documenting during the heat dome differences of about 15 degrees Celsius between one neighborhood and another. And that's Celsius, I'll note. And so about the heat dome event, and Jana has already presented much of this, but what we were able to do was work with the Oregon Medical Examiner's Office to look at the distribution of where the deaths occurred, largely in urban areas, which is marked by the 59 there in Multnomah County, which is where Portland is located. We found that the people who died of in the heat dome we looked at their obituaries actually. This is the majority of the obituaries that were in there. Some of them didn't have obituaries. But what we could find was that the most were above 65. They all lived in buildings that were older buildings, meaning either 1900 to 1969. In Portland, that's considered an older building, likely not in Holland. And so what we saw is that very few people died in the newer buildings that potentially had heat mitigating conditions there. And when we take it a bit further, we actually see that the places where the people died, I've been to every one of these places, were often mobile homes, RV parks, and multifamily residences. There was a contingent of people who also died in single family residences around the region. And this was something we were able to kind of characterize based on the address information for the people who died. So take this in for a second and just look at this distribution of Portland, of where it is that people died, largely on the east side of Portland, some downtown and some in the northwest, but largely in the east side. the 2016 analysis that we did highlighted many of the places where we were seeing deaths occur. And it really kind of told us that these were the areas that had the highest social vulnerability and physical conditions to amplify impacts. And just about 6 months ago, I finished an analysis that looked at what were the implications of these areas in the last, since we did this analysis, in the last 6 years. And we looked at tree canopy as a indicator for cooling in these neighborhoods, because we've really thought about trees as a way to kind of cool the streets, cool the houses, and really bring some bring some respite to these very hot neighborhoods. And what did we find? We compared tree canopy from 2014 to 2020, going right before this heat dome event. And what we observed is that the areas that are implicated and where the deaths occurred were really the places that also lost the greatest amount of tree canopy during this time period of 2014 to 2020. So not only was there already social vulnerability in a very health challenged landscape that many communities were living in, it was further amplified by the loss of shade in these neighborhoods as well. So again, this is something that a recent work that we've done. We took it further to look at another dimension of cooling, and that was specifically related to air conditioning. And we looked at where, working with our Pacific Northwest National Labs, it's a federal laboratory, and we were able to get the distribution of air conditioning units in and around the Portland area. And we found that the air conditioning installations are not random. In fact, income level directly correlates at a very high, statistically significant level to the presence of AC. The higher levels of AC are also, interestingly, in the relatively cooler parts of the city and the city surrounding the area as well. And that the lower levels of AC we found much lower levels of AC in historically marginalized areas of the city, meaning the C and D neighborhoods, if you follow that. And so this is the reason why we recently looked at some data and found that the temperature difference between one household in a hotter part of town and another household in a cooler part of town was 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which would be the difference is 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So help me with that one. That's a 20 some, I would say, degree Celsius difference between one neighborhood and another indoors, right? So the cooler neighborhood was running the AC, the hotter neighborhood was in a hotter neighborhood and didn't have access to AC. So the indoor exposure of heat goes up by that amount. I'll just close out by saying here are the questions that we're really trying to ask at this point in terms of some of this research and some of the direction we're going. We want to know about social vulnerability. Jana mentioned issues of kind of isolation and who's getting exposed. So we're spending a lot of time trying to understand this exposure assessments around social vulnerability. We're trying to understand what we can do about mechanical interventions. Air conditioning improves the likelihood of surviving a heat wave by orders of magnitude. And that is something that we're really looking into. This right to cooling bill is one of those directions that we've been really trying to support. Community awareness is something, again, John had mentioned this, and we're trying to understand human behaviors during heat waves. What do people do for coping? Tree canopy is something, and green spaces is something we're really trying to. We have some funding through some bond measures, some financing that's occurred regionally to be able to move green spaces into neighborhoods. So we're really trying to understand where to put green spaces for the greatest potential cooling effect. And then prioritizing transportation interventions. We have a lot of bus stops that are exposed right to the heat. So thinking about where and how to do that. And finally, a built environment. We're thinking about the density relationship. We have lots of houseless populations here. So how do we increase density, create more housing for populations, and at the same time maintain neighborhood temperatures? So a laundry list of things that we're working on, but I'll just close with my second shameless plug of a book that just dropped on Friday. by one of my PhD students and I worked on, and it's really trying to get at what Jana and I are doing with this project, is really trying to build out this researcher practitioner partnership so that we can bring the best science, we can do the policy work, and that we can kind of move some of these inequities, address some of these inequities that we've seen so persistent in the climate actions that are being taken. So one reflection I'll just note is that we got an enormous amount of media, not only in the heat dome, though even preceding the heat dome. But the heat dome brought so much media attention that even after having worked on this topic for over a decade, I noticed that the media attention has really catalyzed a great deal of policy action. And I had always come out of my PhD program thinking the best science was going to create the best policy. But not surprisingly, in some ways, the amount of conversation and the media helping to generate that really brought a tremendous amount of policy attention and resources into this mitigation and adaptation area. I'll make a provocation that heat waves are better dealt with through preparedness than response. We saw that Jana's description of trying to get communication systems in place, trying to get everything aligned over a short period of time is a very challenging endeavor for any entity. And so really thinking about what can we do to target preparedness activities. And finally, the idea of how do we focus on marginalized groups that often are the first and worst affected by these heat waves and the systems that have perpetuated some of these impacts. My last slide is a invitation for you to come to Portland. We have a heat week. I know you've done this. Jana is very involved with this as well through Portland Bureau of Emergency Management. And we have the 1-year anniversary of the heat dome. So just thought I would offer to you that we're commemorating those who perished during the heat dome event. We're using the opportunity to do a lot of preparedness planning. We have virtual and in-person activities, and then we have a lot of media participation, given what I just noted about the importance of media in relation to driving some policy conversations. You can go to heatweek.org to learn a little bit more. And with that, I'll just go ahead and close out, leave my email address here, and hopefully I didn't go too far over my time limit.
Well, we listened to every second of your presentation. It was very enlightening. And I must say already, because we had our first conversations half a year ago, and in preparing for that and the event we had in Utrecht 2 months ago, it really stimulated among a smaller group also this awareness that, as we say in Dutch, the poorest neighborhoods are the warmest neighborhoods, and contact with you further strengthened that insight, and we are more and more working on that awareness as well. So you're ahead of us in terms of having seen this before, and actually new research is going that level as well, whether we can make 3 layers of know-how about the stony environment of a neighborhood, the heat label, as we say it, from a housing, and the level of vulnerability of the inhabitants, and whether that directs you faster to where you need to be with climate adaptation and heat adaptation, both at the preparedness and response side, but also in longer term actions. So thank you so much of giving us provocable thoughts, but I suppose my co-hosts die with questions or remarks or linking the Dutch connection with you. Lisette, may I give you the floor?
Yeah, thank you. I think this webinar is just too short, only 2 hours or 1 hour. I would like to discuss a whole day, I think, with Jonna and Vivek about this event and what they've learned and what we can learn from this. And I think Vivek really nicely touched upon those 3. Oh, it's unstable, my internet connection. Is it?
Okay, we can do with it.
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
It's okay. Okay.
Good enough.
So yeah, Vivek really nicely touched upon those 3 aspects of how we can battle the heat. Health, health, housing and habitat, and especially housing and habitat. And then concerning the habitat, we of course can design develop our cities differently with more green. And now I'm not sure if well, and we would like to know how effective this actually can be. Well, in terms of reducing the risks, but also in terms of reducing air temperatures. And now maybe I misunderstood you, because first you said that you saw 2.6 degrees of air temperature difference within the city, and then later maybe you said 15 degrees. So I was wondering what are the temperature differences? Could you tell us that again? What are the temperature differences within Portland on average, but also during this extreme heat event? So that's about the habitat. And then about housing, I have this question, and I think a lot of you have this question, because it seems that using air conditioning systems is really normal in the United States, but in the Netherlands, it's really a discussion how we don't want to use air conditioning, or we don't want to propose this as an intervention, or because of a lot of reasons, but also that it really warms up the city again, and we want maybe more. We want to use smart systems that passive systems. So what do you think about this? Or
thank you, Lizette. I went through that very fast, and I'm glad you picked up on the temperature difference question. So just to reiterate, the 2.6 degrees Celsius difference is across the 108 cities that we studied in the US. So that's the average temperature difference between one of these historically segregated red-lined neighborhoods and their green-lined counterpart. So it really is an average across 108. And then when you look at the top city of the 108, which is the one with the biggest difference between the red-lined neighborhood and the green-lined neighborhood, we see that the difference is about 2.8 degrees Fahrenheit, which I think is probably around 6 degrees Celsius is my guess, around maybe, actually it's more probably like 5 degrees Celsius difference between one neighborhood and another in the city of Portland. So that was one of our biggest findings in this work. During the heat dome event, that difference, and this is actually a paper we're working on now, the difference between one neighborhood and another actually went up, almost went up to 25 degrees Fahrenheit difference between the same two neighborhoods. So what we're noticing is that as temperatures go up, the difference between and among the neighborhoods actually also goes up. And so this 5 degrees Celsius difference on a hot day, meaning on a day where it's about maybe 30 degrees Celsius, that difference goes, one neighborhood would be 27 degrees Celsius and another neighborhood would be near 40 degrees or above 40 degrees Celsius. And so that's what we're noticing as these temperatures go up. So just hopefully that provided some clarification. And then in terms of air conditioning, this is a very challenging conversation that we're trying to have. Much of the air conditioning conversation is right now focused on just getting as many air conditioners out into households as possible, not really thinking about the energy source from which that air conditioning power is coming from. We have a lot of hydropower here. So we have a lot of oil or fossil fuel power for sure. We also have a lot of hydropower. So the idea here is to increase the amount of air conditioning first, and then talk about decarbonizing the sources from which the hydropower comes. Because the more AC is run, the more electricity, the greater the overall challenge with climate change. And so that is a very difficult conversation for me to have, in part because a lot of my colleagues, particularly those in Arizona and Southern California, have made very unequivocal statements about the role that air conditioning plays in saving lives, which is 100% true, right? Those with access to AC or cooling will have much higher likelihood of surviving than not. And so it's a challenging conversation to have here because we have about we had about 30% air conditioning across the metro region in 2012, and now we're over 65% air conditioning in households in 2020. And so just in 8 years, we have doubled the amount of air conditioning finding its way into households across the Portland metro region. And Seattle, just north of us, is actually now at about 40%, but after the heat dome, I heard that it bumped it up to over 50% already as well. So the energy source conversation is a sore subject and one that's difficult to really provide a clear answer on.
Very clear. In a way, same is happening here. We've seen a big increase in the buying of air coolers after the 2 heat waves we had in 2019 and 20, and now 1 out of 5 households has an air cooler. So it's not as it's 20%, so not as much as in the US, but it's rising in a similar way. And here I am, the chair of the session, and I see the time clicking through, and we have interesting conversations and many chats on the line. And thank you so much, Jonna, for helping out on all the answers. Very much appreciated. There's one question I would like to pick up from Roland, and maybe you both can elaborate a little bit more on that, is the connection between the observations, the media attention that increases interest. How much of that lands in the politics, and particularly in the funding questions, and the balance between other urgent issues that need to be resolved as well in our times? Can you share any observations on that?
What do you think, Vivek?
Yeah, you're more involved in the politics than I am, John. I think maybe you start there. I'll talk about other things related.
Well, here's what I see, but I want to hear what Vivek thinks very much. I feel like just looking at the budget process that came out this year versus last year, we more greatly emphasized investments in climate resilience around tree planting and hiring more planners to work in our Bureau of Planning and work on building codes and other things related to climate adaptation. But the problem is, maybe this is a universal political problem, like an event causes a quick reaction like, oh no, we have to throw money at the problem now, but this is a kind of a problem that requires sustained action over time. Like you have to plant the tree and then water the tree for 3 years, and then in 20 or 30 years the tree provides benefit. It's very hard to get political attention to an issue that is sustained over time. I feel like we have to shift culture, because if we're just relying on one leader to care about it or not, they care, then the next year they don't care, or they get replaced by somebody else. It's hard. What do you think, Vivek?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, the opportunity to present to you was really a moment for me to reflect on kind of what is it that changed in the last 2 years of my life. Like, I mean, aside from the pandemic and all the challenges that reared up, it really was about the fact that we had been doing this research for quite some time. We had the measurements. We had arguably the most precise air temperature measurements of any city in the country, and dare I say it, the world. I have published on this extensively, and we have 1 meter resolution air temperature maps at morning, afternoon, and evening for the Portland region. Like, I haven't seen anything like that generated. And I've worked with folks in Freiburg and other parts of Germany who are in the World Meteorological Organization, and have had conferences with them. And so we had the best data we could possibly have. So that didn't drive the kind of funding response that Jonna is bringing up. And I had met with the mayor. I've testified in front of city council at least a dozen times around this issue. I have talked to the governor's office at least a half a dozen times around this issue. I've written op-eds for our state newspaper. I have, I've been visible, at least I can say, in this work. And so the challenge that I'm reflecting on is, where did that not quite land, and what did it take in order to catalyze the activity that we're talking about? And what I've frankly come to recognize is that in order for us to be effective, we have to, as scientists, as people who are engaging in that science policy discussion, we have to have everything in our back pockets and ready to spring when the time is right. And that's what I've really come to reflect on through this heat dome. I've been doing this work, getting out there, but until this event happened, I had everything in my back pocket to be able to pull out and present in front of everybody in real time, very quickly. And that is where I think a lot of our work in the universities, a lot of our work in kind of community engagement has to really do that groundwork ahead of time in order for it to be activated on when an extreme event like this occurs.
Tomorrow we're having a discussion with a smaller group of people working on heat to prepare communication-wise for the upcoming summer. What are the messages that we're going to have ready when the heat strikes, if it strikes, because we know then we're going to get the microphones. So you better be prepared for that moment. It's part of the preparedness. But at a sideline, I would like to suggest that we hold a little break and let all the news, all the messages, all the provoking thoughts you brought to our brains come down for a quick break. And I want to make it quick, so 7 minutes. And then we start immediately in breakout groups for around 30 minutes. Everything is short, but at least it's to fill our heads with inspiration and ideas to continue on later. And I think a little bit more can be added to it, but not more than 30 minutes. So if you take a break now, we come back at 20:20 our time, which is 11:10:20 your time in the morning. And then continue our conversations in two groups, one more talking about the preparedness and the crisis manager during the heat, and with Jonna and Helene and myself, and the other one with Vivek and Jeroen and Lisette on particularly, I think, the last issues you mentioned, the knowledge we have more precisely on that and how you can link it straight towards implementation and application by policies and citizens. Have a good break. And have a good breakout group. Welcome back, everybody. We had a lively discussion in the disaster management group, and of course, I ran out of time. I'm sure the same happened in the other group. And many open ends, which is always frustrating, but also good to know that we're on a long road for improving our work on heat. Thank you, Helene, and thank you very much again, Jonna. And you said you would share, you've already done, your email for further questions. I think that's also maybe true for people from the other group. I would like to ask the two chairs of the two groups to give a brief impression of the main lines of the discussion you had, if there were any. It could also be different. And then we try to close this session with some generic thoughts. Helene, may I give you the floor?
Yes. Well, we discussed quite a lot in a limited amount of time, but what I mostly recall is that we discussed quite extensively on how to communicate. So communication was one of the themes that came up. Not only what the best way to communicate is, so the best media type, but also who should be the messenger. And one of the things that that also was discussed is that in this sense, community people, so from NGOs, but also other types of communities can play a very big role here. And in terms of community, we also discussed not only having one-way community communication, but also two-way communication and having hotlines available for people to ask questions during a heat wave. And the other thing that that was discussed quite extensively is the voluntarism. So the fact that especially in the United States, there's a big culture of voluntarism, and that also in the United States you have these neighborhood emergency teams that are already there and that can be activated during a heat dome. And I think that that was also quite an important thing to reach, not only people, but also people that are really at risk. Did I forget anything?
Anyone from the group? Roland is totally pleased. Then I'm pleased as well. Thank you very much, Helene. Jeroen or Lisette from the other group?
Yes, I can try to summarize it. It was not There were so many questions and there were so many answers, but what I learned is that there's still so much to learn from each other, and the way what happened in Portland is so much more and more aiming at the extreme of the disasters, and that looking at different things. But in the Netherlands, maybe we are a bit ahead in really designing the cities for making it green and having guidelines for this. And we even spoke about the guidelines about 300 meters for within each house in a cool spot. And Vivek explained that they would have resilience hubs in buildings, which is quite different, but maybe for a disaster, a better thing than only some shade. We talked about what if our level of above the 26.5 degree for new houses is appropriate. And we didn't come out of this, but something to find out. Vivek explained that this extreme event was really something to learn about what people can bear and what they can't. So that's maybe some interesting research he has been doing, and I think we should look more at Portland to know how to act on an extreme event. Yes, there were different questions. Did I forget anything what we really want to say now, Lisette or Vivek?
Well,
Oh.
I think, well, you already mentioned a little bit, but we really learned from each other. And that's also really nice. We learned from Vivek, and Vivek heard, I think, new things from us. And what I found very interesting was also what he said about Delhi, when that last heat event, or this heat event that earlier on, for people to find a cool place at night where they could sleep. So that's good also, I think it's just a bizarre idea maybe, but also a very good idea, but it's, so maybe I sometimes look for a nice cool spot in my house where I can sleep, but maybe I can pitch up my tent in a park next summer.
Thank you. I have one question, Jonna, and Vivek, to both of you. As said, we in the Netherlands, since years or two, we've defined our domains of area in Dutch, gebied, gebouw, gezondheid. And it translates also nicely in English in health, housing, habitat. Is that a frame that works, or is it too artificial? Does it help to connect the long-term planning and adaptation with the preparing for the heat wave itself? What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, John, I'll go. I really like the framing a lot, in part because it aligns. I mean, I like it because it aligns with the approach we're trying to move forward. We're thinking about health as a, health is a very integrative concept. So it allows that opportunity for not just the health department or the health bureau to be involved, but there's social determinants of health, the idea that, and social and environmental determinants of health, the idea that there are multiple means by which health is made. And rather than thinking of somebody as, health being the lack of sickness, it's health being the ability to really thrive and to do well and to really pursue one's ambitions. And so thinking about health in a kind of a broader frame would be great. We're in a Heat Week, for example, which we mentioned. We're having a mental health and climate conversation, which is a dimension that I know a lot of communities in the Portland metro, as well as the US, are struggling with, trying to manage the mental health challenges. And then housing, of course, it's about infrastructure, and Americans love to build. And so it's all about build, baby, build. And so thinking about how that infrastructure can be responsive to the needs of the time, as well as kind of housing challenges that we're having. And so habitat, I really think about in relation to housing, but also in relation to the ecosystem of the area that we are trying to create around our housing, meaning the trees, the green spaces, the blue spaces in and around our neighborhoods that really can help reduce temperatures. And so I think there's a lot of value there. I might encourage you, it's a nice alliteration as well, health, housing, and health, housing, and habitat from an English perspective, but I might encourage you to think about this notion of connectivity. It doesn't have a nice H in there, but one of the things we've found is that communities that are better connected respond much better to natural hazards generally. And so the question of how do you create more connectivity in a community, both informally and formally, I think that would really be a nice addition to the health, housing, and habitat, because those can be done all individually, and we also need to think about the community perspective.
Thank you very much for this this add-on to these domains. We do have it in the picture. As I said earlier, we do see that it also helps you focus on where the need is highest and the social action is needed most. Well, these are my final thoughts, but I'm just the chair of the session. Is anyone, and now that we're a smaller group after the webinar and have had our further breakout groups, anyone would like to have a last word of reflection on this webinar? With flabbergasted.
I think yes, I certainly like to hear more of you, Vivek. Maybe I have to start to read the papers you wrote, but the measuring and the indication of the difference in temperature during the day, in the morning, and in the afternoon, I think it's very interesting. We are also on the point that we want to have more insight in this in the Netherlands, because we need it. And so I think there will be lots of things to use exchange on. Also using mist, the mist point, I think it's very interesting to know how efficient they are and or how easy they are and how safe they are and everything. So I think there are many things we can discuss on. So I will get in contact with you, and I'd like to thank you very much also, Anna, for showing your case and explaining what you're doing.
Thank you, Jeroen. Well, with your final words and being exactly at 9 p.m., I think we can close a very helpful and very interesting and very encouraging also webinar on having a kind of insight in the future that we all dare not to face here, but we know now it is happening. I remember talking to meteorologists. They said, all of them said, we did not understand what we saw, but we saw it. So that's part of what we see more and more, that as you said earlier, Jonna, it's beyond imagination that we need to prepare for. And that's hard enough. But it had happened, and it's happening right now in India and Pakistan for a very long period. And we've seen the unimaginable melting of the Arctic and the Antarctic at the same time a few weeks ago. So it is happening, and it will demand on us all our imagination, but also goodwill and willing to connect. And it was really, really wonderful to connect with you tonight, with all of us. And it will strengthen our connection in the Netherlands to work harder and better on addressing heat risks and to addressing social vulnerability at the same time. And we look very much forward to staying in connection with you, and I'm sure that will happen. And to all the participants, thank you much for staying here, and we look forward to see you soon again in a Dutch Connection. There's a lot happening. We're getting more and more connected in our networks, from the health side, from the housing side, from the habitat side. So it's good to work further on this, and we'll see what this summer will bring. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.